Greetings. My name is Roger Robinson. I want to thank Olevs and the other organizers for the opportunity to join you today to talk about the economic and financial security dimensions of the threat that faces the Baltic nations and Europe more broadly, not to mention the transatlantic relationship. Uh, I have quite a lot of experience on the Soviet Union then and Russia now side of things, but over the past 15, 20 years, my focus has increasingly turned, not surprisingly, to China. And I want to talk a little bit about the use by these leading adversaries of the West uh, of Western and US in particular capital markets, that is, our stock and bond markets. It turns out that the United States is probably a principal, if not the principal dollar funder of the Chinese Communist Party, for example. It is also home to at least 8 US sanctioned Russian companies, surprisingly, that are in the portfolios of many millions of unwitting American investors. So it's not just a China problem, to a much lesser extent, I will say, that it's Russia as well. In the case of China, however, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, even multi-trillion dollar sums over the past several years in terms of the kind of money, dollars that they've been able to attract through debt and equity offerings in our capital markets, as well as trading in index funds and a host of other investment vehicles. And as I say, it's not an exaggeration to suggest that there are tens of millions of Americans that are holding not just Chinese and Russian companies, but the wrong sorts of such companies. Now, this is also true of Europe, whether it's you're talking about the London, Frankfurt, Milan, Paris exchanges. All of them are suffering from the same circumstance, which is decades of the absence of any kind of security-minded and human rights-minded due diligence. That is, trying to understand who these Chinese and Russian companies are in our various markets, in the capital markets area, as well as their network of subsidiaries. What kind of track record of abuses might they have? Are they connected to the Russian and Chinese militaries? Are the security services? Have they been implicated in human rights abuses, including equipping concentration camps in Xinjiang, China, that's holding over 1 million Uyghurs and other religious minorities? These are pressing questions, it turns out, and they've seen a good deal of the light of day in the United States, really for the first time, starting in March of 2019, when we started to release extensive research on this subject, which we had accumulated over the previous 3 or 4 years. That said, there have been a number of actions taken that have actually put the focus at the presidential level in the United States on these types of issues. Chinese companies, for example, were going to be admitted into the federal thrift savings plan, the retirement system of some 5.7 million federal employees, including our military. They would be holding not just Chinese companies, but bad actors, as we say, folks that companies that are associated with the People's Liberation Army, advanced weapons manufacturers, companies that are building and militarizing the islands in the South China Sea, those implicated in the kind of police state surveillance system that's been established by China, not to mention the concentration camps in Xinjiang and social credit scoring, other means by which the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party in particular takes control of its people. In the case of Russia, it's companies that were implicated in the 2014 invasion of Ukraine and who've been engaged in other security-related abuses around the world in such a way as to be sanctioned by the Office of Foreign Asset Control of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. So it's one thing to be holding the companies of leading adversaries. That's a kind of sporty proposition to begin with, because they are all able to be pressed into service by the state for various nefarious activities, whether it's espionage or being pressed into strategic objectives of their governments. After all, these companies are almost entirely state-owned or controlled. But to make matters worse, as I say, when you really do the analysis and the homework, you find that they are very, oftentimes very implicated in a host of national security and human rights wrongdoing. And that calls for special treatment. And the President of the United States, for example, decided to prohibit Chinese companies from being included in the Federal Thrift Savings Plan within 2 weeks of it being implemented. So it took a year and a half of steady effort on the part of some of us to persuade the White House that this is the right thing to do. At the end of the day, that was a successful effort. And indeed, this administration has been trying to exclude the wrong sorts of Chinese companies, or any Chinese companies, from being part of federal sponsored pension plans, for example. So that's one concrete case where an intervention was made. More recently, there was an executive order by the president that called upon U.S. investors, whether they be individual or institutional, to be prohibited from holding the stock and bonds of those Chinese companies that appear on an official list of the Department of Defense because of their PLA, People's Liberation Army affiliations, the so-called Pentagon PLA list, as I affectionately refer to it. And this was a big step. It was the first time in the history of the United States, to at least my knowledge, when we used capital market sanctions. This is a very potent lever, both toward China and Russia, that's never seen the light of day. And I dare say that the same kind of problems that we've been afflicted with are also, as I said, present in Europe. For example, there's not one Chinese company that's compliant with US federal securities laws. They don't submit to federal government audits, for example, of their financials. In fact, they don't disclose their financials at all, which are regarded as state secrets. American companies could never get away with this kind of thing, so that China is actually receiving preferential treatment to their American corporate counterparts. I suspect the same is true in Europe, whereby federal regulators that are trying to engage in the protection of European investors through a host of regulatory measures are seeing the same kind of abuse or problems where China is not willing to play by the rules. It's just that simple. Not to mention some of these bad actors, because on the corporate side, the diligence, the kind of national security, human rights scrutiny that's required to stop this kind of thing has been notably absent, and it's a big problem. So I would really say that this is an area that we're particularly interested in focusing on to a greater extent, and I would hope that this kind of new focus will contribute to the tools available to the West to staunch the wrong sorts of power projection by China and Russia in your region and beyond. With that, I think I'll close out, and thank you again for the opportunity to participate. Bye now.